Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight, as the world outside slowly quiets and the noise of the day begins to loosen its grip on you, we're stepping into a softer side of history, a side rarely spoken of aloud. Tonight, we're exploring how women's anxiety was treated across centuries, long before it had a name, a diagnosis, or even permission to exist. This is a gentle journey through ancient beliefs, medieval faith, quiet rooms, enforced rest, and finally, the slow moment when fear was allowed to be human. It's not a story of blame or judgment, but a calm reflection on how anxiety has always walked beside care, responsibility, and survival. A bedtime history about silence, listening, and the long path toward understanding. So before you get comfortable, take a gentle moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if these deep sleep history stories help you find peace, sleep better, or simply reflect on our shared journey through time. Now, close your eyes, let your breathing slow, and allow history to carry you gently into rest. There was a time when fear had no diagnosis, no label, and no gentle word to soften it. Only silence. The kind of silence that settled into the body and stayed there for years. Long before the idea of mental health existed, long before anxiety could be spoken aloud without shame, women lived with a constant, unnamed weight pressing quietly against their thoughts and breath. In ancient societies, fear was not something to be explored or understood. It was something to be endured, hidden, or explained away by rules written by others. A woman who trembled without cause, who could not sleep, who felt her heart race in stillness, was rarely seen as unwell. She was seen as weak, undisciplined, or morally unstable. Anxiety, when it appeared in women, was not treated as an inner experience, but as a flaw in character, a deviation from what was expected. Ancient physicians often spoke of balance, of humors and bodily fluids, but the inner world of emotion remained largely invisible. If a woman felt overwhelmed by fear, it was not her mind that was questioned, but her nature. Her emotions were believed to rise from the body rather than the self, as if fear itself were proof that she could not be trusted with her own thoughts. In many early cultures, women were taught from childhood that fear was a sign of disobedience, not distress. To be anxious was to fail at calmness, to fail at obedience, to fail at silence. There was no space to ask why the fear existed, only pressure to suppress it. Ancient medical texts spoke calmly of organs and functions, but when women suffered inwardly, the language grew vague and symbolic, drifting into metaphors rather than care. Anxiety was often described as wandering, restless, unanchored, as if it were not a response to the world, but a strange movement inside the body itself. This distance between experience and explanation created a quiet loneliness. Women learned early that naming fear brought judgment, not comfort, and so fear became something carried privately, passed down through generations without words. Mothers did not explain anxiety to daughters, they taught endurance instead. In temples and homes alike, fear was prayed away, disciplined away, or ignored entirely. What is striking is not the cruelty of this silence, but how ordinary it was. No one thought they were being unkind. They believed this was simply how the world worked. Without a name, anxiety could not be shared, and without sharing, it could not be softened. And yet, even in this silence, women continued to live, to raise families, to create rituals, to hold communities together while carrying invisible storms inside them. Their fear did not make them fragile, it made them quietly resilient. This chapter is not about diagnosing the past, but about listening to it, about noticing how long fear existed before language arrived to meet it. Tonight, as you rest, it is enough to know this: anxiety did not begin with modern life. It lived beside humanity from the beginning, unnamed, misunderstood, and carried most heavily by those who were never allowed to speak it aloud. When fear could not be explained, it was often assigned a place inside the body, and for women, that place became a quiet and lasting burden. Ancient medicine did not search for anxiety in thoughts or memories, but in flesh and movement, in organs believed to wander, to rise, to press upward and disturb the mind. The idea that fear might come from experience, loss, or uncertainty was rarely considered. Instead, women's anxiety was folded into theories of imbalance, as if the body itself were misbehaving. In many early medical traditions, the female body was viewed as unstable by nature, softer, more fluid, more easily disrupted. When a woman felt panic without danger, sorrow without loss, or dread without reason, the explanation was not emotional depth, but bodily error. Anxiety became something physical, something mechanical, something to be corrected rather than understood. Treatments followed this logic. Instead of conversation or comfort, women were prescribed routines meant to restore order, enforced rest, controlled diets, isolation, or rituals designed to calm the body without ever addressing the fear itself. The mind was treated as a secondary space, echoing whatever the body was believed to do wrong. What made this especially heavy was the absence of blame directed outward. The world was never questioned. Hardship, confinement, loss of autonomy, and constant vigilance were not considered possible sources of anxiety. Instead, responsibility returned again and again to the woman herself. If fear persisted, it meant the body had failed to obey. This belief settled into culture, shaping how women spoke about themselves. Anxiety was not something happening to them, it was something they were doing incorrectly. Over time, this turned fear into shame. A woman experiencing anxiety learned to distrust her own sensations, to see her racing heart or shallow breath as evidence of defect rather than distress. Silence became a form of self-protection. Speaking of fear risked diagnosis, correction, or removal from daily life. And so many women learned to perform calmness while carrying unease quietly beneath it. In households and healing spaces alike, women were encouraged to remain still, to soften their voices, to regulate their expressions, as though fear could be smoothed away by posture alone. Ancient healing practices often blurred into spiritual discipline, where fear was treated as a failure of harmony rather than a response to reality. This approach offered structure but not relief. It allowed fear to be managed without being acknowledged. And yet, within this system, women adapted. They developed private methods of coping that never appeared in medical texts. Repetitive motions, whispered prayers, nightly rituals, small acts of grounding that kept them functional. These were not cures, but survival strategies. What history rarely records is how much emotional labor was required simply to appear composed. Anxiety did not disappear, it learned to hide. By framing fear as a bodily flaw, ancient medicine unintentionally erased the inner lives of women, flattening rich emotional landscapes into simple mechanical problems. Tonight, as you rest, it may be comforting to remember that the past did not lack anxiety, only language for it. Fear was present, persistent, and deeply human, even when misunderstood. And the women who lived with it were not broken bodies needing correction, but sensitive minds navigating worlds that offered them very little safety. As ancient medicine struggled to contain women's anxiety within the body, society quietly shifted its explanation elsewhere, into morality, discipline, and control. Fear no longer belonged only to flesh or imbalance. It became a reflection of character. A woman who worried too much, who hesitated, who felt dread in silence, was increasingly seen not as unwell, but as misaligned with virtue. Anxiety began to carry moral weight. Calmness was praised as obedience, while fear was interpreted as resistance. In many cultures, a woman's emotional state was expected to mirror the order of her household and community. When anxiety appeared, it was assumed something within her had failed to submit. Religious and philosophical traditions often reinforced this idea gently, without cruelty, but with lasting consequence. Fear was framed as a lack of faith, a lack of trust, a failure to accept one's place in the world. This reframing did not shout, it whispered. It taught women that inner unrest was not something to explore, but something to correct through humility and restraint. Over time, anxiety became intertwined with guilt. To feel afraid without visible danger was to question the structure that promised safety, and questioning, especially from women, was rarely welcomed. The expectation of composure grew heavier. Silence became not only protection, but virtue. A calm exterior was treated as proof of moral strength, while visible anxiety suggested inner weakness. This belief shaped generations. Women learned to measure themselves not by how they felt, but by how well they concealed it. Emotional control was praised, not emotional understanding. Fear, once unnamed, now carried quiet judgment. And still, anxiety persisted. It lived in sleepless nights, in careful words left unspoken, in bodies trained to remain still while thoughts moved endlessly. What history rarely acknowledges is how exhausting this balance was. To be anxious and good at the same time required constant vigilance. Women became experts in self-monitoring, adjusting tone, expression, posture, and breath to avoid appearing unsettled. This was not healing. It was adaptation. Anxiety did not fade under moral pressure, it deepened inward. Yet within this narrowing space, something subtle endured. Women continued to notice their inner lives even when they could not name them. They shared understanding in glances, in rituals, in quiet companionship. They learned that fear did not mean failure, even if society insisted otherwise. This chapter closes not with resolution, but with recognition. Anxiety did not wait for modern language to exist. It moved patiently through centuries, reshaped by medicine, morality, and silence, yet never erased. Tonight, as the world grows quieter, it may be comforting to remember that fear has always been part of the human story. It is not evidence of weakness, nor disobedience, nor moral flaw. It is simply the mind responding to uncertainty. And the women of the past who carried anxiety without name or permission were not fragile figures in need of correction, but resilient witnesses to a world that asked them to be calm without ever offering them safety. For nearly 2,000 years, anxiety in women had a name, and it was not a gentle one. Long before fear was discussed as emotion or experience, it was captured by a single word that followed women across centuries like a shadow: hysteria. Its origin lay in the ancient Greek word hystera, meaning uterus. And from that beginning grew a belief that would shape medicine, culture, and women's inner lives for generations. The idea was deceptively simple and deeply powerful. When a woman experienced fear, unrest, sleeplessness, or silence, the cause was not her world, her losses, or her thoughts, but her body, and more specifically, her womb. Anxiety was no longer nameless, it was assigned a source, and that source was inseparable from being female. This explanation carried an illusion of understanding. By giving anxiety a name, ancient thinkers believed they had mastered it. But what they truly created was a story that confined women's emotions to biology alone. Hysteria became a container into which almost any behavior could be placed. Fear without danger, tears without cause, withdrawal, restlessness, exhaustion, even quietness itself could all be folded neatly into the diagnosis. The word traveled easily because it simplified complexity. It removed the need to ask difficult questions about society, power, or suffering. Instead, it pointed inward toward the female body, as if anxiety were a malfunction rather than a response. Over time, hysteria became more than a medical idea. It seeped into everyday language and expectation. A woman who appeared unsettled was not curious or overwhelmed, she was hysterical. The term did not describe what she felt, it defined who she was. And because it was rooted in anatomy, it suggested permanence. Anxiety was not something that happened to women, it was something they carried by nature. This belief shaped treatment in subtle ways. Women were not invited to explain their fear. Their voices were secondary to interpretation. Silence, ironically, became further evidence of hysteria, proof that the condition had deepened. Even resistance to the label could be taken as confirmation of it. What made hysteria so enduring was its flexibility. It could adapt to different eras while preserving its core message. Women's anxiety did not need to be understood, only managed. The word traveled from ancient texts into medieval thought and later into early modern medicine, changing shape but never truly loosening its grip. For centuries, it offered a convenient explanation for discomfort that society preferred not to hear. And yet, beneath the weight of this word, women continued to experience anxiety as something very real, very human. They felt fear in response to uncertainty, grief in response to loss, unrest in response to confinement. Hysteria did not create anxiety, it simply renamed it in a way that stripped it of context. Tonight, as you listen, it may feel strange to realize how familiar this word still sounds, how often it has echoed forward into modern language. This chapter does not aim to shock, but to gently uncover how a single term came to stand in for centuries of unspoken fear. Hysteria was never just a diagnosis, it was a story about control, about whose emotions were taken seriously and whose were quietly explained away. And for women, it became a name that lingered long after the fear itself was forced into silence. As the idea of hysteria moved beyond ancient medicine and into the medieval world, it began to change its tone, quietly absorbing religious meaning and moral anxiety. Fear in women was no longer explained only as a wandering organ or bodily imbalance, but as something more unsettling, a sign of spiritual disorder. Medieval thinkers lived in a universe shaped by divine order, where everything had a place and purpose. Within this worldview, anxiety did not simply appear, it suggested disruption. And when that disruption emerged in women, it was often interpreted as a failure of obedience, faith, or inner discipline. Hysteria became a word that bridged medicine and morality, allowing fear to be understood not just as physical instability, but as a threat to spiritual harmony. A woman who felt restless, fearful, or withdrawn could now be seen as vulnerable not only to illness, but to temptation, deception, or influence beyond her control. Anxiety became suspicious, silence became ominous, sleeplessness became evidence of inner turmoil that required correction. In this environment, hysteria gained a new power. It justified intervention. Religious guidance, confinement, ritual cleansing, and enforced devotion were offered as remedies, not out of cruelty, but from a belief that order must be restored. Women were encouraged to surrender fear through prayer, fasting, and submission, practices meant to quiet the soul as much as the body. The problem was not fear itself, but what fear implied: doubt, resistance, or deviation from the expected path. Over time, this framing deepened the distance between women and their inner experiences. Anxiety was no longer simply misunderstood, it was morally risky to acknowledge. To admit fear was to admit spiritual weakness. To struggle inwardly was to risk suspicion. And so many women learned to internalize anxiety in ways that left no visible trace. They became skilled at appearing devout, calm, and composed, while carrying unease beneath the surface. The label of hysteria followed them quietly, ready to explain any deviation from ideal behavior. What made this period especially lasting was how seamlessly hysteria blended into everyday life. It was not a dramatic accusation, but a gentle assumption. Fear was redirected into discipline. Anxiety was reframed as a lesson to be learned, rather than an experience to be heard. The body and soul were treated together, yet neither was truly listened to. This system did not erase anxiety, it refined it. Fear became quieter, more inward, more difficult to express. And yet, even in this restrictive space, women continued to sense that their anxiety was not random. It responded to confinement, to uncertainty, to loss, to lives shaped by limited choice. These connections were rarely written down, but they were felt. Shared glances, whispered conversations, and unspoken understanding created a quiet continuity between women across generations. Hysteria, despite its authority, could not fully silence this awareness. Tonight, as you listen, it may feel strange to realize how much of this language still echoes in modern assumptions. The idea that anxiety reflects weakness, lack of faith, or insufficient discipline did not vanish with the medieval world. It lingered. This part of the story is not about blame, but about recognition. Hysteria became a moral threat because society needed fear to mean something manageable. By turning anxiety into a spiritual issue, the world avoided asking harder questions about safety, power, and care. And the women who lived within this framework were not broken believers or fragile minds, but human beings navigating fear in a world that demanded calm above all else.
As Europe moved slowly toward the early modern age, hysteria did not disappear, it adapted. The language around it softened, became more refined, more scientific in tone, yet its core assumption remained largely unchanged. Fear in women was still something to be explained from the outside rather than listened to from within. Physicians began to write with confidence, cataloging symptoms, measuring behaviors, and recording cases as if anxiety could finally be contained through observation alone. Sleeplessness, trembling, withdrawal, sudden tears, or unexplained dread were now documented carefully, but still grouped beneath the same familiar label. The womb no longer wandered through the body in medical imagination. yet its symbolic presence remained. Hysteria became a nervous condition, a disorder of sensitivity, a problem of fragile systems rather than fragile worlds. Science promised neutrality, but it inherited centuries of assumption. Women's anxiety was still treated as evidence of excess, of instability, of an inner imbalance that required regulation. Treatments changed shape, but not intention. Instead of prayer alone, there were baths, rest cures, isolation, controlled environments designed to quiet the mind by removing choice. Silence was prescribed as medicine. Emotional expression was seen as stimulation to be reduced. Once again, the goal was not understanding fear, but containing it. What made this era distinct was its confidence. Hysteria was no longer whispered about, it was discussed openly in lecture halls and texts, presented as settled knowledge. And yet, women themselves remained largely absent from these conversations. Their experiences were interpreted, summarized, and translated into symptoms, while their voices faded into case notes. Anxiety became something that could be observed without being felt. The scientific gaze offered distance, and distance offered control. Still, beneath this structure, the same pattern persisted. Women's fear was rarely connected to the realities of their lives. Limited autonomy, social pressure, loss, confinement, and expectation were not central to diagnosis. Instead, anxiety was framed as a malfunction of nerves, sensitivity, or temperament. The label of hysteria carried authority now, backed by institutions rather than tradition alone. To resist it was to resist reason itself. And so many women complied, entering treatments that promised calm but often delivered erasure. Yet even here, anxiety did not vanish, it changed rhythm. It learned to express itself quietly, subtly, through the body when language was unavailable. Faintness, fatigue, and withdrawal became safer expressions than fear itself. History often celebrates this period as progress, and in some ways it was, but progress does not always move in straight lines. While medicine refined its tools, it still struggled to hear women as full narrators of their own experience. Hysteria remained a convenient explanation, adaptable enough to survive scientific scrutiny while preserving its original imbalance of power. This chapter closes not with resolution, but with transition. The word hysteria would eventually be challenged, questioned, and slowly retired, but its shadow lingered long after. Tonight, as you rest, it may be reassuring to know that modern understanding did not emerge fully formed. It was shaped by centuries of listening imperfectly. Anxiety in women was never invisible. It was simply translated into languages that made it easier to manage than to understand. And the women who lived through this era were not passive subjects of history, but quiet witnesses to a system still learning how to listen.
Treatment did not mean comfort. It meant control. In the ancient world, when women's anxiety could no longer be ignored, it was not met with reassurance or understanding, but with methods designed to quiet the body and silence the mind. Healing was not imagined as relief, but as restraint. Physicians and caretakers believed that fear could be subdued if the senses were dulled, if stimulation was reduced, if emotion itself could be made still. Herbs were among the first tools used, not chosen for empathy, but for effect. Plants known to slow the body were prepared carefully, steeped into drinks or ground into powders meant to soften awareness. These substances did not ask why a woman felt anxious.
They simply made the feeling harder to reach. Calm was achieved not through safety, but through sedation. The goal was not clarity, but quiet. Cold water followed a similar logic. Immersion was believed to shock the body into balance, to interrupt restlessness by force. The suddenness of cold was thought to reset the system, to replace fear with physical sensation strong enough to override it. In these treatments, anxiety was never invited to speak. It was interrupted. Over time, isolation became one of the most common responses to persistent fear. A woman who could not rest, who appeared unsettled, who withdrew inwardly, was often placed apart from daily life. Darkened rooms, reduced contact, and prolonged silence were prescribed as medicine. The absence of sound and light was believed to calm the nerves, to drain emotion until only stillness remained. Yet what was called calm was often emptiness. These spaces were quiet but not comforting. They removed stimulation, but they also removed connection. The world grew smaller. Days blurred together. Fear did not vanish. It echoed inward. What united these treatments was not cruelty, but certainty. Ancient healers believed they were helping. They trusted that emotional intensity was dangerous, especially in women, and that safety could be restored by minimizing sensation. Anxiety was treated as excess energy, something to be cooled, dampened, and contained. The inner life of the woman was not considered a source of knowledge, but a disturbance to be managed. And so healing became something done to her, not with her. These practices left little room for dialogue. Silence was both method and outcome. The quieter a woman became, the more successful the treatment was believed to be. Stillness was mistaken for peace. Over generations, this approach shaped expectations. Women learned that expressing fear invited intervention, while quiet endurance was rewarded. Calmness became performance. Anxiety learned to hide. Tonight, as you listen, it may feel strange to recognize how familiar this pattern still is. The idea that strong emotion must be reduced, controlled, or muted did not begin in modern times. It has deep roots. This part of the story is not meant to disturb, but to gently illuminate how care once focused on quiet rather than comfort. And within that quiet, women endured, adapted, and survived, even when relief was never truly offered. Among the most common responses to women's anxiety in the ancient world were plants, chosen not for healing the mind, but for softening awareness itself. Herbs carried a quiet authority. They were seen as neutral, natural, unquestionable, gifts of the earth meant to restore order where emotion seemed to overflow. Preparations were slow and deliberate, leaves crushed, roots steeped, liquids darkened with time, each step reinforcing the belief that calm could be brewed. When women were given these remedies, the intention was rarely to understand what troubled them. The intention was to slow them down, to dull sharp edges, to make fear less visible. Many of these plants induced heaviness, warmth, or drifting sensations that blurred thought and softened memory. Anxiety did not disappear, but it lost its urgency. Worry became distant, like a sound heard through walls. This distance was interpreted as success. The quieter the mind appeared, the more effective the treatment was believed to be. Yet this calm came at a cost. With sensation muted, clarity faded as well. Women often described feeling removed from themselves, present but not fully awake, compliant but not at ease. Their inner world was quieted but not soothed. Alongside herbs, scent and ritual played a subtle role. Aromatic substances were burned or applied with the belief that the senses could be guided into stillness. Sweet, heavy fragrances were thought to anchor wandering thoughts, to pull attention inward and downward. These rituals were not dramatic. They were repetitive, slow, and designed to reduce variation. Predictability itself became a form of control. The body was encouraged to respond automatically, to associate certain smells, textures, or temperatures with rest. Anxiety was treated as a disruption of rhythm, something that could be corrected by imposing a steadier pace. Over time, these methods shaped how women experienced fear. Anxiety became something to endure quietly while waiting for its edges to soften. There was little expectation of resolution. Relief was temporary, fragile, dependent on continued treatment. Without herbs, without ritual, fear was expected to return. This reinforced the idea that anxiety belonged to the body rather than the world, that it was a condition to be managed, not a message to be heard. What is striking is how these practices mirrored broader expectations placed on women. Emotional intensity was discouraged, stillness was rewarded. Calmness was seen not as a state of safety, but as a sign of proper regulation. Women learned to accept that relief came from outside themselves, administered by others, measured by silence. Their role was not to understand their anxiety, but to comply with its suppression. Yet, even within this framework, women found small ways to adapt. Some used ritual as grounding rather than restraint. The repetition of preparation, the familiarity of scent, the quiet moments before rest became islands of personal meaning. These moments did not cure anxiety, but they offered brief shelter from it. History rarely records these private interpretations, but they mattered. They allowed women to survive treatments that were never designed for comfort. Tonight, as you listen, you may notice how familiar some of this still feels. The desire to quiet the mind without asking why it is restless did not vanish with ancient medicine. It echoes in modern habits, softened by new language. This part of the story is not about condemning the past, but about understanding its logic. Herbs, scents, and rituals were attempts to restore calm in a world that feared emotion. They brought silence, but not peace. And the women who lived within these practices learned to navigate anxiety in ways that left few traces, except in the quiet endurance that carried them forward.
When herbs and rituals were no longer enough to quiet women's anxiety, silence itself became the treatment. Isolation was not seen as punishment, but as protection, a way to shield the mind from stimulation believed to provoke unrest. In ancient and early societies, a woman overwhelmed by fear was often removed gently from daily rhythms and placed into spaces designed to be empty. Darkened rooms, minimal sound, limited contact, and long stretches of solitude were prescribed as medicine. The belief was simple: if the world became quiet enough, anxiety would follow. Light was softened or removed. Conversation was reduced or eliminated. Time slowed until days lost distinction. These spaces were meant to calm the nerves by offering nothing for them to respond to. Emotion was expected to fade when there was nothing to trigger it. Yet silence has its own weight. In isolation, thoughts do not disappear, they echo. Anxiety, deprived of outward expression, turns inward and grows subtle, persistent, difficult to name. What appeared from the outside as rest often felt inside like suspension. Women were encouraged to remain still, to wait for calm to arrive on its own. Expression was discouraged, movement limited, agency reduced. Stillness was equated with healing. The quieter a woman became, the more successful the treatment was believed to be. But quiet is not always peace. These periods of isolation taught women that connection was considered dangerous, that emotion was something to be minimized rather than met. Over time, this shaped how anxiety was experienced. Fear learned to speak softly, to hide beneath compliance. Women became attentive to their own smallest reactions, adjusting themselves to avoid further removal from the world. Silence became both refuge and warning. What makes this approach especially haunting is how ordinary it was. Isolation was not dramatic or violent. It was calm, methodical, often framed as care, yet its effects lingered. Being separated from community reinforced the idea that anxiety made one unfit for participation. The message was quiet but clear. To be anxious was to step outside the acceptable rhythm of life. And so, many women learned to remain present without being fully seen. History rarely records their inner experience during these times. The rooms were quiet, the records sparse. What survives are assumptions about improvement measured by absence. Fewer words, fewer tears, fewer visible signs of distress. Relief was defined by disappearance. Yet anxiety does not vanish through absence, it adapts. In silence, it becomes internalized, woven into posture, breath, habit. It becomes something carried rather than expressed. This is not a story of cruelty, but of misunderstanding. Ancient healers believed that peace could be created by subtraction. If sound, light, and interaction were removed, fear would dissolve. What they could not see was that connection itself is often what softens anxiety. The absence of comfort does not create calm, it only removes witnesses. And yet, within these quiet spaces, women endured. They found ways to mark time, to ground themselves in breath, in memory, in the smallest details of existence. These were not cures, but acts of survival. Tonight, as you rest, it may be comforting to recognize how far understanding has traveled, even if imperfectly. Silence was once prescribed as medicine, not because it healed, but because it controlled. This chapter closes with that recognition. Anxiety was never truly treated in these rooms, it was contained. And the women who passed through them were not fragile minds needing emptiness, but human beings longing for safety, understanding, and connection in a world that offered quiet instead.
In medieval Europe, anxiety was not an illness, it was a weakness of faith. Fear did not belong to the body or the mind, but to the soul, and when it appeared in women, it was interpreted through the language of belief. Medieval life was shaped by a deep certainty that the world operated according to divine order. Every event, every emotion, every misfortune had meaning within a spiritual hierarchy. In this framework, inner unrest could not be neutral. Anxiety suggested misalignment with God's will, a failure to trust in divine protection. For women whose lives were already defined by obedience and restraint, fear carried particular weight. A woman who worried excessively, who could not sleep, who withdrew into silence, was often seen as spiritually fragile. Her anxiety was not explored as an experience, but evaluated as a moral state. Calmness became a visible sign of righteousness, while fear hinted at doubt. This belief was rarely expressed with anger. It was taught gently, woven into sermons, prayers, and daily instruction. Women were encouraged to examine themselves, to search their hearts for the source of unrest. Anxiety became something to confess rather than understand. In monasteries, homes, and villages alike, women learned that fear was a message from God, a call to humility or repentance. The solution was not relief, but correction. Prayer was prescribed not as comfort, but as discipline.
Repetition, ritual, and submission were meant to quiet the soul by aligning it more closely with divine order. When fear persisted, it was taken as evidence that faith had not yet deepened enough. Silence became an act of devotion. To endure anxiety without complaint was considered virtuous. Speaking of fear risked being seen as spiritually immature. Over time, this perspective shaped how women related to their inner lives. Anxiety was not a signal of distress, but a test. Passing the test meant remaining composed. Failing it meant continued scrutiny. What is striking is how complete this system felt. It offered meaning, structure, and explanation, even as it denied comfort. By framing anxiety as a moral matter, medieval society avoided confronting the hardships women faced daily: limited autonomy, constant labor, loss, and uncertainty. These realities were absorbed into spiritual narrative, leaving little space for emotional care. Yet women adapted. They learned to translate fear into prayer, restlessness into ritual, dread into silence. These practices did not remove anxiety. They reshaped it into something acceptable. Fear became quieter, inward, clothed in devotion. Tonight, as you listen, it may feel gentle rather than shocking to consider how deeply belief shaped emotional life. This chapter is not about condemnation, but understanding. In a world where faith explained everything, anxiety became another thing to be judged by devotion, and the women who lived within this framework were not faithless or weak, but human beings navigating fear in the only language they were allowed to use.
In medieval Europe, when anxiety in women persisted, prayer became the primary prescription. It was offered not simply as solace, but as a structured response meant to correct the soul. The act of praying was repetitive, rhythmic, and intentionally consuming, designed to occupy the mind until fear had no space to speak. Women were taught specific prayers for unrest, prayers for doubt, prayers for sleeplessness, each one reinforcing the idea that anxiety was a spiritual problem requiring spiritual labor. This labor was quiet and constant. Hours spent kneeling, whispering words memorized rather than chosen, were believed to draw the mind away from fear and toward obedience. Relief was not measured by comfort, but by compliance. A woman who prayed faithfully despite anxiety was praised for endurance. One who continued to struggle was encouraged to pray more deeply, more often, with greater humility. Confession followed naturally. Fear was examined for sin, worry traced back to pride, restlessness linked to lack of trust. The inner world became a ledger of moral accounting. Anxiety was something to be admitted, repented, and disciplined into silence. In this environment, women learned to watch their thoughts carefully, to monitor inner movement for signs of spiritual failure. Emotional awareness did not disappear, it turned inward and vigilant. The goal was not understanding fear, but purifying it. Silence supported this process. Speaking openly about anxiety risked spreading doubt or revealing weakness. Quiet suffering was framed as devotion. Many women found meaning in this structure. Prayer offered routine, predictability, and a sense of order in uncertain lives. It allowed fear to be placed within a narrative of purpose. Yet, it also limited what could be expressed. Anxiety that did not yield to prayer was not seen as deserving of care, but as evidence of incomplete faith. Over time, this belief shaped behavior. Women learned to translate distress into spiritual language, to speak of fear as temptation rather than pain. Emotional expression narrowed. Calmness became proof of righteousness.
This system was gentle in appearance, but demanding in practice. It required constant self-surveillance, constant correction, constant alignment. For some, prayer did bring moments of peace. The repetition soothed the body, the cadence slowed the breath, the familiar words offered a temporary anchor. But these moments were fragile. They depended on continued effort. Rest was conditional. Anxiety was never resolved. It was managed through devotion. This chapter does not dismiss prayer as meaningless. Rather, it reveals how it was used as treatment in a world that lacked other frameworks. Faith offered explanation when medicine could not. It provided structure where understanding was absent. Yet, by placing anxiety entirely within the moral realm, medieval society avoided confronting the lived realities that produced fear. Women carried the burden quietly, believing that endurance itself was the cure. Tonight, as you listen, it may feel calming to imagine the slow rhythm of medieval prayer, the dim light, the stillness. But beneath that calm lived many unspoken fears. Prayer became a way to contain anxiety, not to release it. And the women who knelt in silence were not failing believers, but individuals doing their best to survive fear in a world that equated peace with obedience.
As prayer became routine and anxiety remained, medieval society turned increasingly toward confession and silence as tools of discipline. Fear in women was now treated as something to be examined publicly and corrected privately. Confession offered a structured space where anxiety could be spoken, but only in a specific form. Women were encouraged to translate unrest into moral language, to identify fear as doubt, worry as pride, restlessness as temptation. The act of confessing did not aim to explore emotion, but to classify it. Once named as moral weakness, anxiety could be managed through prescribed behaviors. Silence followed confession as both remedy and proof of progress. A woman who confessed faithfully and then remained quiet was seen as improving. Her calm was not measured by comfort, but by compliance. Over time, this cycle shaped social expectations. Emotional restraint became a marker of virtue. Expressing fear too openly risked judgment, suspicion, or exclusion. The safest path was inwardness. Women learned to monitor themselves constantly, adjusting speech, expression, and even posture to avoid appearing unsettled. Anxiety did not disappear, it became regulated. This regulation extended beyond religious spaces into everyday life. Communities valued predictability and order, and women were expected to embody both. Fear that disrupted routine was unwelcome. Silence became social currency. It signaled obedience, humility, and trust. Those who could not maintain it were seen as spiritually and socially unstable. What is striking is how gently this system operated. There was no need for force. Belief itself enforced discipline. Women internalized expectations until control came from within. Anxiety was no longer imposed from outside. It was self-managed through guilt and restraint. This made the system remarkably durable. Fear was contained without visible conflict, yet the cost was profound. By framing anxiety as a moral failure, medieval society denied women permission to seek care, comfort, or understanding. Distress became something to overcome alone. Confession allowed momentary release, but only within narrow boundaries. Silence quickly closed those boundaries again. Over generations, this shaped how anxiety was experienced. Fear learned to exist quietly, folded into daily prayer, labor, and routine. It became background noise rather than a cry for help. History often praises the Middle Ages for their clarity of belief and order, but beneath that order lived countless unspoken fears. Women carried them while maintaining appearances of devotion and calm. This chapter closes with recognition rather than judgment. Medieval approaches to anxiety were not born of cruelty, but of certainty. Faith offered answers when understanding was limited. Silence promised peace when emotion felt dangerous. Yet, anxiety persisted, adapting to each constraint placed upon it. Tonight, as you listen, it may be comforting to know that fear has always sought expression, even when denied language. The women of medieval Europe were not morally weak for feeling anxious. They were human, living in a world that asked them to be calm, faithful, and quiet, even when their inner lives told a more complex story. Silence became medicine. By the 17th and 18th centuries, Europe's understanding of anxiety had shifted once again, not toward compassion, but toward order. Fear in women was no longer framed only as sin or bodily imbalance. It was now seen as disruption. A woman who could not conform to expected rhythms of work, speech, and behavior was increasingly viewed as unfit for public life. Anxiety, especially when persistent or visible, was interpreted as a threat to social stability. And so new spaces emerged, not designed for healing, but for containment. Asylums were built with calm intentions and rigid logic. They promised quiet, separation, and routine. The belief was that order itself could restore the unsettled mind. Silence was no longer a personal virtue, it became institutional. Women whose anxiety made them restless, withdrawn, or unpredictable were placed inside these quiet rooms, removed from families and communities, not always by force, but often by agreement shaped by fear and misunderstanding. The asylum was presented as refuge, a place where noise, choice, and complexity were stripped away. Inside, days followed strict patterns. Movement was regulated. Speech was limited. Emotion was discouraged. Anxiety was not discussed, it was absorbed into the architecture. Thick walls muffled sound. Long corridors slowed pace. The environment itself was meant to teach stillness. What mattered was not how a woman felt, but how she appeared. Calm behavior signaled success. Silence meant improvement. In these institutions, anxiety was not treated as an experience to be understood, but as behavior to be corrected. Women were expected to adapt to the space rather than the space adapting to them. For many, the quiet was heavy. Removed from familiar roles and relationships, they learned to live within narrow boundaries. Fear did not vanish, it softened into resignation. The absence of stimulation reduced visible distress, and this reduction was taken as proof of recovery. Yet the cost was profound. Being labeled unfit marked a woman's identity permanently. Once inside, it was difficult to return. Anxiety became a reason for exclusion rather than care. The asylum system reflected broader social values of the time: productivity, order, and restraint. Women who could not align with these values were set aside. There was little cruelty in intention, but there was great indifference to inner life. Silence was easier to manage than emotion. Structure felt safer than understanding. And so, anxiety was quieted, not healed. Tonight, as you listen, it may feel peaceful to imagine these spaces: slow footsteps, muted voices, steady routines. But beneath that calm lay a quiet sadness. The women inside were not dangerous or broken. They were overwhelmed, sensitive, and often simply exhausted by lives with few choices.
This chapter is not about outrage, but recognition. The quiet rooms were built to create order in a noisy world. They succeeded in producing silence. What they did not produce was relief. And the women who lived within them carried anxiety forward, softened but unresolved, waiting for a future that would finally learn how to listen.
Inside the quiet rooms of the 17th and 18th centuries, order became the language of care. Asylums were structured around routine, not because routine healed anxiety, but because it made behavior predictable. For women labeled as anxious, predictability was the goal. Days unfolded according to strict schedules that left little room for choice or spontaneity. Waking, eating, walking, resting, and sleeping all followed a measured rhythm, repeated without variation. This repetition was believed to soothe the unsettled mind by replacing uncertainty with structure. Anxiety, after all, was seen as disorder, and disorder was something that routine could correct. The concept of normal began to take shape within these walls. Normal was quiet. Normal was compliant. Normal was still. A woman who followed instructions without resistance, who spoke softly or not at all, who moved slowly and predictably, was considered improving. Her inner state was irrelevant. What mattered was alignment with the expected pattern. Those who struggled to conform were seen as resistant rather than distressed. Routine did not ask why a woman felt anxious. It asked only whether she could adapt. Over time, this system taught women to measure themselves against external standards rather than internal well-being. Anxiety became something to suppress in order to fit in. Emotional expression was not forbidden outright, but it was discouraged through subtle signals, lowered voices, watchful glances, delayed privileges. Compliance was rewarded with stability. Deviation brought restriction. This created a quiet pressure to perform calmness. Women learned that safety lay in predictability. To be anxious was to risk further confinement. To appear composed was to move closer to release. Yet for many, release never came. The definition of normal was narrow, and once a woman had been labeled unfit, it was difficult to redefine her. Anxiety, especially in women, was treated as a permanent sensitivity rather than a temporary response. Even when outward signs faded, the label remained. Routine maintained order, but it did not restore agency. Life within the asylum was steady, but it was not free. The rhythm that promised calm also erased individuality. Days blended together, distinguished only by minor variations in task or light. Over time, anxiety softened into passivity. The mind learned not to react because reaction had no place to go. This quieting was interpreted as success. Yet it was a success defined by absence. Absence of complaint, absence of movement, absence of visible fear. What remained unmeasured was the cost of this calm. Routine taught women to disappear gently into structure. Their anxiety did not end, it became managed through conformity. History often frames these institutions as steps toward modern psychiatry, and in some ways they were. They introduced observation, classification, and care that was less overtly punitive than earlier eras. But they also solidified the idea that women's anxiety was a problem of social fit. To be anxious was to fail at normalcy. To be normal was to be quiet.
Tonight, as you listen, it may feel soothing to imagine the slow rhythm of these spaces, the regular footsteps, the predictable hours. That steadiness had its appeal in a chaotic world, but beneath it lay a quiet loss. Order replaced understanding, routine replaced care, and the women who lived within these systems learned to trade expression for acceptance, waiting for a future that might finally allow anxiety to be seen as human rather than disruptive.
For many women, the quiet rooms were not temporary places of rest, but long destinations shaped by labels that were difficult to escape. Once anxiety had been institutionalized, it became part of a woman's identity. She was no longer simply afraid or overwhelmed. She was recorded, classified, and remembered as unfit. The asylum did not only separate women from society, it slowly taught society to forget them. Families visited less often. Names faded into records. What remained was routine, repetition, and an endless present. Anxiety, which had once been an inner experience, was now managed through distance. The longer a woman remained inside, the more normal the silence seemed. Her stillness was taken as evidence that she belonged there. This was the quiet tragedy of the asylum system. It did not rely on cruelty or spectacle. It relied on time. Days turned into months. Months softened into years. And with each passing season, the possibility of return grew thinner. Women learned to live within the narrow expectations of institutional life. Expression was carefully measured. Emotion was rationed. Fear became something to be carried inward, where it could not disrupt order. In this environment, anxiety transformed again. It became muted, flattened, almost invisible. From the outside, this looked like improvement. From the inside, it felt like disappearance. The long silence of the quiet rooms belonged to the past, but its echo remains. It reminds us that anxiety has often been treated not as a voice to hear, but as a sound to remove. And the women who lived through that silence were not failures of society, but reflections of a world still learning how to care.
In the Victorian era, anxiety in women was finally given a medical name, but that name did not bring freedom. It brought a new form of obedience. Doctors spoke softly of nerves and exhaustion, yet their solutions reflected older fears of independence and emotion. The most famous of these solutions was the rest cure, a treatment that promised calm through complete stillness. Women suffering from anxiety, restlessness, or emotional overwhelm were instructed to lie in bed for weeks, sometimes months, removed from intellectual activity, conversation, and decision-making. Reading was forbidden. Writing was discouraged. Even light knitting or thought was considered dangerous. The belief was that a woman's mind, overstimulated by education, creativity, or worry, had exhausted her nervous system. Anxiety was not seen as a response to confinement or inequality, but as the consequence of thinking too much. Rest, therefore, was not simply about recovery, it was about restraint. By enforcing inactivity, the rest cure aimed to return women to a quieter, more compliant state. Silence was framed as healing. Passivity was framed as balance. Obedience was framed as health. Many women entered this treatment willingly, trusting the authority of physicians who spoke with confidence and concern. Others were urged into it by families who believed it was the most caring option available. Inside these rooms, time slowed dramatically. Days blended into one another.
With no books, no writing, no meaningful conversation, the mind turned inward. Anxiety did not disappear. It lingered, often intensified by isolation and boredom. Yet outward expression was limited. A woman lying still, speaking little, appeared calm. This appearance was taken as proof of success. The rest cure did not ask whether a woman felt better. It asked whether she was quieter. The Victorian fascination with order and propriety shaped every aspect of this treatment. A calm woman was a moral woman. A still woman was a proper woman. Anxiety challenged these ideals by revealing unrest beneath the surface. Rather than listening to that unrest, the rest cure sought to suppress it. The body was made still so that the mind would follow. Over time, this approach reinforced a powerful message. Emotional discomfort was a failure of self-regulation. Women learned to doubt their own perceptions. If anxiety persisted, it was assumed they had not rested enough, not surrendered enough, not obeyed enough. The cure demanded patience, submission, and silence. Some women reported moments of relief, especially early on as physical exhaustion eased. But for many, the treatment drained identity rather than restoring it. Creativity dulled, confidence faded, the sense of self narrowed to the boundaries of the bed. Anxiety softened into resignation. What makes the rest cure especially haunting is how gentle it appeared. There were no restraints, no visible punishment, just quiet rooms, attentive nurses, and the insistence that rest was best. Yet beneath this softness lay control. The rest cure managed anxiety by managing women. It reduced complexity. It limited agency. It rewarded compliance. Tonight, as you listen, it may sound almost peaceful to imagine such stillness, but that peace was imposed, not chosen. The Victorian rest cure marks a turning point in the history of women's anxiety, where medical language replaced religious judgment, but the expectation remained the same. Be calm, be quiet, and do not ask too much of the world or yourself.
As the Victorian rest cure spread, authority over women's anxiety quietly shifted from the church to the clinic. Doctors replaced priests as the interpreters of inner unrest, but the moral structure remained. Where faith once measured devotion, medicine now measured compliance. Physicians spoke with certainty, presenting scientific language that felt modern, rational, and undeniable. Yet beneath this language lay familiar assumptions about femininity and control. Women's anxiety was explained through weakness of nerves, excess imagination, or emotional fragility. The solution was not empowerment, but supervision. Doctors prescribed rest with confidence, positioning themselves as guardians of balance and order. Families deferred to their expertise, believing medical authority to be neutral and objective. In reality, the rest cure reinforced a hierarchy where women's inner experiences were interpreted by others and corrected from outside. The treatment relied on isolation not only from activity, but from influence. Visitors were limited, letters were restricted, opinions were filtered. This separation was believed to protect the nervous system from stimulation, but it also removed women from dialogue. Without conversation or creative expression, women lost the language to describe their own distress. Anxiety became something observed rather than spoken. Doctors assessed progress by surface calm, not internal relief. A woman who lay quietly, ate when instructed, and showed little emotion was considered improving. Her silence was evidence.
The Victorian fascination with science gave this process legitimacy. Charts replaced confessions, diagnoses replaced moral judgment. Yet the outcome was similar. Anxiety was something to be subdued rather than understood. The rest cure also reflected broader anxieties of the era. Industrialization, urban growth, and changing gender roles unsettled traditional structures. Women seeking education, creative work, or independence were increasingly labeled nervous or overstimulated. Anxiety became a convenient explanation for resistance to prescribed roles. Rest was offered as correction. By removing women from public and intellectual life, the rest cure quietly reaffirmed boundaries that were being challenged. Many women sensed this contradiction. Some complied outwardly while feeling inwardly diminished. Others resisted silently, finding ways to think, imagine, or observe even while confined. A few later wrote about their experiences, revealing how the treatment intensified rather than relieved anxiety. These voices were rare but significant. They exposed the gap between appearance and reality. The rest cure did not restore balance, it enforced stillness. Yet it was praised because it produced visible order. In a society that valued composure above complexity, that was enough. This chapter invites quiet reflection rather than judgment. The Victorian doctors believed they were helping. They worked within the limits of their knowledge and culture, but their certainty left little room for listening. Anxiety was treated as excess energy to be drained, not as information to be explored. Tonight, as you listen, notice how familiar this pattern still feels. Authority promises calm. Silence is rewarded. Complexity is reduced. The rest cure reminds us that medical progress does not always mean emotional understanding. It marks a moment when women's anxiety was firmly placed under professional control, softened in tone, but still managed through obedience. As the rest cure became widely accepted, its consequences slowly revealed themselves, not in medical journals, but in the quiet erosion of women's inner lives. Weeks of enforced stillness often stretched into months, and months reshaped identity. Lying in bed without books, writing, or meaningful conversation did not empty the mind, it stripped it of anchors. Thoughts circled endlessly, untethered by action or expression. For many women, anxiety did not fade into calm. It transformed into a dull, persistent unease. The treatment promised restoration, yet delivered dependence. When activity was finally allowed again, confidence had often thinned. Decision-making felt foreign. The world beyond the room appeared louder, sharper, more overwhelming than before. Stillness had not healed sensitivity, it had magnified it. Some women sensed this early. They felt themselves shrinking, their curiosity fading, their sense of purpose dissolving into routine obedience. A few dared to speak about it, cautiously at first, aware that resistance itself could be interpreted as illness. Their words were often dismissed as further evidence of nervous instability. Yet these early voices planted seeds of doubt. They suggested that anxiety was not caused by too much thought, but by too little agency. That rest imposed without choice could deepen distress rather than relieve it. Over time, these insights began to surface more clearly. Women who later wrote about their experiences described the rest cure as suffocating rather than soothing. They spoke of mental stagnation, loss of self, and a creeping sense that their inner world was being ignored. These accounts challenged the prevailing narrative of benevolent care. They did not reject rest itself, but questioned the assumption that silence and obedience were inherently therapeutic. The rest cure had treated anxiety as excess energy to be drained away. These women reframed it as a response to confinement, limitation, and unacknowledged emotion. Their reflections marked a quiet turning point. The Victorian ideal of calm femininity began to crack, revealing the cost beneath its surface. Yet change was slow. The authority of medicine remained strong, and many women continued to endure treatments that prioritized order over understanding. Anxiety once again adapted. It learned to hide beneath compliance, to speak through fatigue rather than fear. The legacy of the rest cure lingered long after its decline. It shaped assumptions about women's emotional resilience, reinforcing the belief that stillness equaled stability. Even as psychiatry evolved, traces of this logic remained. Prescribe calm, limit stimulation, reward quiet. Tonight, as you listen, this chapter invites gentle recognition rather than anger. The women subjected to the rest cure were not passive victims, nor were the doctors simple villains. They were participants in a system that valued surface calm over inner truth. The cost of stillness was subtle but enduring. By demanding obedience in the name of healing, the rest cure delayed a deeper understanding of anxiety as meaningful rather than disruptive. This chapter closes with a soft awareness. Anxiety does not dissolve when silenced, it waits. And the women of the Victorian era, lying quietly in carefully ordered rooms, carried that waiting forward, toward a future that would slowly begin to listen.
Very slowly, fear became understandable. As the 20th century unfolded, the language surrounding anxiety began to soften. The rigid certainty of earlier centuries gave way to questions rather than commands. Psychology emerged not as a cure-all, but as a listening practice. For the first time in history, anxiety was increasingly framed not as sin, disorder, or failure, but as a response to experience. Women's fear began to be discussed in relation to memory, environment, stress, and loss. This shift did not happen suddenly, and it did not happen evenly, but it marked a profound change in tone. Instead of silence, there were conversations. Instead of obedience, there was interpretation. Early psychologists and therapists spoke of inner conflict, unconscious tension, and emotional overload. They acknowledged that anxiety could arise from lived realities rather than personal weakness. For women, this recognition offered something new, the possibility that their fear made sense. Yet this new understanding existed alongside old assumptions. Gender bias did not disappear, it simply adapted. Women's anxiety was still often linked to sensitivity, emotionality, or fragility, but the emphasis shifted from control to explanation. Therapy rooms replaced confinement. Talking replaced enforced stillness. The act of speaking itself became part of healing. Women were encouraged, sometimes tentatively, to describe their feelings, their worries, their dreams. This was a radical departure from centuries of enforced quiet. Anxiety was no longer something to be removed from view, but something to be explored. The pace of this change was slow. Many women still faced skepticism. Emotional distress was often minimized or attributed to domestic dissatisfaction rather than broader structural pressures. Yet even within these limits, a new possibility emerged. Fear could be shared. It could be named without immediate punishment. Psychology did not erase anxiety, but it reframed it. Instead of asking how to suppress fear, it asked where fear came from. This question alone marked a turning point. It suggested that anxiety carried information, that it might be a signal rather than a flaw. For women, long taught to doubt their inner lives, This was quietly revolutionary. Therapy sessions were often gentle, repetitive, and reflective. Listening replaced instruction. Understanding replaced correction. These environments were far from perfect, but they allowed space where women's voices could exist without immediate judgment. Anxiety began to lose its moral weight. It became human. Tonight, as you listen, this chapter offers a sense of easing. After centuries of silence, fear was finally allowed to speak, not loudly, not confidently, but softly and cautiously. The 20th century did not solve anxiety, but it changed the question being asked. And sometimes, being asked is the first step toward rest.
As psychology matured through the 20th century, anxiety began to be placed within the flow of lived experience rather than isolated inside the individual. Therapists, researchers, and clinicians slowly started to notice patterns that could not be explained by temperament alone. Wars reshaped societies. Economic instability unsettled families. Social rules shifted, often unevenly and painfully. For women, these changes were profound. Many carried the weight of loss, displacement, responsibility, and expectation at the same time. Anxiety was no longer seen only as a personal condition, but as a response to strain. This realization changed how fear was approached. Instead of asking women to adapt endlessly, some practitioners began asking what they were adapting to. Trauma entered the conversation, cautiously at first. The emotional impact of war, grief, and prolonged stress was acknowledged, even if imperfectly. Anxiety was linked to memory, to unresolved shock, to environments that offered little rest. This perspective did not immediately erase gender bias. Women's fear was still sometimes dismissed as exaggeration or emotional excess, but the framework had shifted. Anxiety could be contextual. It could be meaningful. Talking therapies expanded, offering women a place to tell stories rather than simply report symptoms. The act of narration itself became grounding. By tracing experiences, women could begin to see patterns in their fear, moments where anxiety surged not without reason, but in response to real pressures. This process was slow and often fragile. Many women were still expected to prioritize others over themselves, to carry emotional labor quietly. Yet, even within these constraints, the idea that anxiety reflected life rather than failure took root. Psychology started to value empathy alongside diagnosis. Listening became a skill, not an afterthought. For women who had spent generations being silenced, this shift mattered deeply. It did not remove anxiety, but it softened its edges. Fear became less isolating when it could be shared and understood. Therapy spaces, though limited by class and access, offered a rare pause. Within them, women could rest without being ordered to rest. They could speak without being corrected. Anxiety, once hidden or disciplined, was allowed to unfold at its own pace. This was not a complete liberation. Medical systems still held authority. Social expectations remained heavy, but a subtle warmth entered the conversation. The tone changed from control to curiosity. The question was no longer how to quiet women, but how to support them. Tonight, as you listen, this chapter invites a sense of gentleness. The 20th century did not resolve fear, but it gave it a place to exist. Anxiety became part of the human story, woven into relationships, memory, and change. And in being acknowledged, it lost some of its power to overwhelm. By the late 20th century, a quiet but meaningful change had taken root.
Anxiety was no longer approached solely as something to eliminate, suppress, or correct. Slowly, it began to be seen as a signal, not an enemy to fight, but a message to understand. This shift did not arrive with fanfare. It emerged through countless conversations, case studies, and lived experiences that gently challenged old assumptions. Women's anxiety, in particular, started to be reframed as a response to pressure, imbalance, and unmet needs rather than inherent fragility. Therapists began to speak of boundaries, stress, identity, and self-awareness. The question evolved from how do we make fear stop to what is fear trying to say? This subtle change altered the emotional landscape. Anxiety was allowed to exist without immediate judgment. Women were encouraged to notice sensations, thoughts, and patterns with curiosity rather than shame. This approach did not promise instant relief. Instead, it offered understanding over time. Fear became part of an internal dialogue rather than a command to retreat. Gender bias had not disappeared. Women were still often expected to manage emotions gracefully and quietly, but there was now language to describe exhaustion, overload, and imbalance without moral weight. Anxiety could be linked to work, caregiving, inequality, and social expectation. It could be named without being diminished. This recognition brought a new kind of calm, not the enforced calm of silence, but the gentle calm of being understood. Rest was reimagined not as obedience, but as care. Listening replaced correction. Choice replaced confinement. For many women, this did not erase anxiety, but it softened their relationship with it. Fear no longer defined them, it informed them. The 20th century closed with a growing awareness that mental health was dynamic and deeply human. Anxiety was no longer a single story of weakness or disorder. It was many stories, shaped by context, history, and individual life. This understanding continues to unfold. Tonight, as you listen, this chapter offers a sense of completion. The long journey from silence to speech, from punishment to listening, from control to care, has been slow and imperfect, but it has moved forward. Anxiety is no longer something women must endure alone or hide in quiet rooms. It is something that can be met with attention, patience, and kindness. As this story gently fades, you may allow yourself to rest in that awareness. Fear does not need to disappear for rest to arrive. It only needs to be acknowledged. And in that acknowledgement, the body softens, the mind loosens, and sleep finds its way in.
Tonight, as you listen, remember that fear has always been human. Long before it had names, theories, or treatments, it lived quietly inside people's lives, shaped by time, expectation, and circumstance. This story has traveled across centuries, not to judge the past, but to observe it gently. Each era believed it was doing what was necessary. Each generation acted with the tools and beliefs it had. Anxiety was misunderstood, silenced, disciplined, medicalized, and eventually listened to. None of these responses existed in isolation. They reflected the values of their time. For women, this journey carried additional weight. Their fear was often interpreted through the lens of morality, obedience, or fragility, not because women felt more, but because they were allowed to express less. History shows us patterns rather than villains. It reveals how fear was shaped by systems larger than any single individual. When silence was praised, anxiety became hidden. When order was valued, fear was confined. When obedience was expected,
rest was enforced, and when listening slowly emerged, anxiety found room to breathe. This reflection is not an attempt to correct the past, but to soften our understanding of it. The women who lived through these centuries were not broken, nor were they weak. They adapted, endured, and carried forward emotional knowledge that had not yet found language. Anxiety followed them not as a flaw, but as a response to pressure, loss, responsibility, and care. As the world changed, so did the ways fear was held. Tonight's reflection invites you to release the idea that anxiety must always be solved. History suggests something quieter, that fear often asks to be witnessed before it can rest, that understanding does not arrive suddenly, but gradually, through patience. The long arc of this story bends toward gentleness, not perfection. As you lie here, listening, you are part of that arc. Your own moments of worry are not separate from this history. They belong to a shared human experience that has unfolded slowly over time. There is no urgency in this realization, no instruction to fix or improve, only the invitation to rest inside understanding. Fear has always existed, and so has the capacity to soften it. As the night deepens, you may allow this awareness to settle. Nothing more is required of you. The story has been told, and now it can fade into quiet. As this story comes to rest, there is no lesson to memorize and no conclusion to force. History, especially when told softly, does not ask for judgment. It asks for presence. The women whose anxiety shaped this journey are not distant figures trapped in the past. Their experiences echo quietly into the present, not as warnings, but as reminders. Fear has always moved alongside care, responsibility, love, and expectation. It has lived in bodies asked to hold too much for too long without space to release. And yet, through every century, something gentle persisted. Even when fear was misunderstood, even when silence was imposed, the human capacity to endure and adapt remained. Tonight, you are not being asked to compare yourself to history or to draw meaning from suffering. You are only invited to notice how understanding itself can be restful, to recognize that anxiety does not need to be pushed away in order for calm to arrive. Often, calm begins when resistance softens, when fear is allowed to exist without urgency. The quiet you are entering now is not empty. It is full of continuity, full of countless lives that learned, slowly, that rest is not earned through obedience or silence, but found through acceptance. This is why history for sleep is told the way it is, not to stimulate the mind, but to ease it, not to demand attention, but to offer companionship in the dark. As your breathing slows, the story no longer needs to continue. Its purpose has already been fulfilled. If this reflection helped your thoughts drift more gently, if your body feels even slightly heavier, you are welcome to remain here. There is nothing more you need to do. The past can remain where it belongs. The present moment is enough. And sleep, when it comes, will come naturally.